Each week we try to go through something that's happening in the news that's topical, has something to do with gun violence prevention, maybe, and or veterans. Since we're in the midst of the Democratic National Convention, it makes sense that we talk about something that is election related today. So a few things. Obviously, the biggest news of the week was that the Biden campaign selected Senator Kamala Harris for the Vice President Biden's vice presidential candidate. I got it right. Everytown for Gun Safety responded by calling this the strongest presidential gun safety ticket in history. So when we think about the election, when we think about gun safety, Everytown has obviously said that they're very much on board with that selection. Additionally, going from sort of top to bottom here, today, Everytown for Gun Safety Victory Fund and Everytown for Gun Safety Action Fund announced their plans to spend at least $10 million to elect gun sense majorities in state legislative chambers this fall. So as part of that effort, Everytown's going to aim to flip state legislative chambers in Arizona, Iowa, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Texas, as well as picking up seats in key states like Florida and Georgia. In total, Everytown's going to spend $60 million to elect gun sense candidates up and down the ballot in 2020. That's double what they spent in 2018. And we hope to involve veterans in key elements of the overall electoral strategy, which happens to be the topic we're going to cover in this forum meeting number 6, which is going to happen 4 weeks from tonight. So stay tuned for that if that's something you're interested in. All right, moving on. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our subject matter expert for this forum, Rob Wilcox. Rob Wilcox is Everytown's Deputy Director of Policy and Strategy. He's an attorney with over 15 years of experience in advocacy. Rob has managed key areas of Everytown's work, including federal policy advocacy, the school safety platform, and advocacy campaign, and key federal and state legislative campaigns. Some of you may recall that Rob joined us 4 weeks ago to share his wisdom on the topic of guns in schools. We're very lucky to have him back to talk to us about ghost guns. And before I turn it over, I do want to say one thing about ghost guns to complement everything Rob is going to say. And that is, there are basically 2 types of veterans on this call today. One is a veteran who is already scared to death about the ghost gun problem in this country. The other type of veteran is the kind that will be scared to death after they learn more about ghost guns from Rob. And that should about cover that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rob Wilcox.
Chris, your introductions are way too good, and it makes it way too hard for me to follow and meet the mark. But I am thrilled to be back with you and with everyone else to talk about ghost guns. It is an issue that is growing exponentially in terms of the threat to the United States, and it's something where I think all of the points Chris has made intersect, both where veteran voices could be instrumental in raising up this issue, exposing this loophole, but also with the right president in the White House, this is actually an issue we can address on day one with strong executive action, and we can close this loophole. So while I will talk about kind of this issue and the problem, and I will talk about firearms, something that you are as familiar with as just about anyone in the country, what I really want to get to by the end is the solution that is right in front of us and that we can grab by exposing this issue, by winning this election, and by getting a gun sense president into the White House. So let me share my screen because I feel that this is an issue that lends itself to slides and visuals, and we have a really excellent digital team who really helped us visualize these presentations. I should say this is actually a presentation that our members of our field team regularly give out to chapters and volunteers. So it was designed to be something that could be done by to the public, because I think that is like the best way to really spread awareness is by sharing this information. All right. So the first point I want to make is that ghost guns are the fastest growing gun safety problem facing this country. They have begun showing up rapidly, dramatically, and in all sorts of acts of gun violence, from unintentional shootings in Syracuse, New York, where an uncle unintentionally shot his nephew, to everyday gun violence, where you see homicides and robberies and crime gun recoveries spiking. and the reporting that follows it from, the few of the headlines here: ghost guns proliferate as Philadelphia grapples with gun violence, to a huge increase in spike in ghost gun parts being acquired during this pandemic, to kind of wrap in current events, to mass shootings. A 16-year-old school shooter in Northern California went to school, killed 2 classmates and injured a third. And the survivor is someone who I work with and present with frequently. She's an incredible 16-year-old named Mia. But he used a ghost gun. And as I'm going to talk about, it was perfectly legal to get all the parts you need to build the gun, no matter what your age is, no matter what your background is. And that is fundamentally the problem, is it undermines every single one of our gun safety laws, because you can avoid every single check and prohibition by buying pieces and parts that the ATF has decided are no more dangerous than paperweights. And I should say that not only do we see the increasing frequency of these firearms showing up in crime, but to put a kind of fine point on it, that the sellers of these parts, we've been tracking them and investigating them, have all reported being sold out during the pandemic. They're saying we're back ordered for weeks, you got to come back. And so what we're seeing is ghost guns being introduced into our country, and I'm going to talk about who's really acquiring them in a little bit. And those ghost guns aren't going away, right? They're going to be with us, and that's going to be a problem we have to deal with. But there's a loophole that we can solve. So, just to kind of make sure that we're all using the same terminology, I like to talk about what is a ghost gun. And the way I like to think about it is that it's a firearm that's homemade and not made by a licensed manufacturer. That's point 1. Point 2 is that it's unserialized, no serial number, which makes it untraceable by law enforcement. And point 3 is that all the parts and pieces that you would need can be acquired without a background check. And so with that broad definition, you actually can get a few different types of ghost guns. Downloadable guns, something you may have heard of, 3D printed guns. Those qualify, right? Those are often made out of plastic with 3D printers, but you can acquire the 3D printer and the computer code without a background check. And the firearm you produce, you make yourself, and it doesn't have a serial number. So that fits the category. There are machines called computer numerical control machines. These, with the right software, will be programmed to do all of the milling and drilling and constructing to build your firearm. It's a kind of more sophisticated process, but you can acquire those machines and program them without the background check, and you can get the parts you need without a background check. But the category that is the biggest driver of this issue, and the one I want to spend my time talking about, are guns made from unregulated, what are known as unfinished frames and receivers and other parts. It is a marketplace that has really boomed in the past 10 to 15 years. And we are, as this market has boomed and matured, we are now starting to see the ramifications in our communities. So a receiver, I think you all will know well, is the part of the gun that contains the trigger group. And if we move to this slide, which is the one I think is kind of most descriptive, you can see, 2 images that, appear to be very similar. I think we've kind of labeled the areas of difference, but on one hand, you have what is considered a firearm by the ATF, because our federal law doesn't just regulate operational weapons that can fire projectiles using the technical terms, but they operate the frame or receiver of any such weapon. And that's because the federal government was looking to say, we want to place restrictions on how firearms are sold, who's selling them, to whom they're being sold to, and are there background checks, but also the core parts, the frame and receiver. And as you can see here, what ATF is saying is, well, this qualifies as a receiver under the federal law. And they say there's a few critical elements. There's 3 holes that are drilled and the firearm control cavities milled. And on the other side, you see what they consider to be an unfinished receiver. It can be sold in the same manner and fashion as a paperweight, as an iPhone case, as a piece of IKEA furniture. And what it's missing are 3 holes and a milled out firearm control cavity. The frame of a handgun, as you can see here, as you're familiar with. And when we look at this side-by-side image, we can see the distinction that the federal government is making between a frame that qualifies under the federal gun laws and one that doesn't. And the differences are rails that are filed, holes that are drilled, and then some more milling that occurs down the barrel. And again, this is where the ATF will say, on the one hand, we have a firearm that is fully regulated under our federal gun laws about who can buy it, right? No felons, no domestic abusers. who can sell it if they're engaged in the business, only licensed firearms dealers, and how do you sell it with a background check. But on the other hand, you have a piece of metal that the ATF will say is nothing. They won't recognize it. They say that it can be bought or sold without license, process, regulation, or protection. Now the question, I think the obvious question is, well, how do you get from that unregulated piece to the operational frame of receiver? And the truth is, the work that we've done working with firearms experts, and investigating the market shows that it's incredibly easy, because each unfinished frame of receiver is sold with a jig, which is basically a guide that you can wrap around either the frame or receiver, which will show exactly where you have to mill, exactly where you have to drill, and exactly how you can go from unfinished part to fully operational frame or receiver. And frankly, it takes household tools. I've seen one semi-automatic handgun frame be finished in 15 minutes in a YouTube video that has about 1 million views, and the individual didn't even use power tools. He was using a hand drill and a file, and it took him 15 minutes. For a receiver, for an AR-15, you're looking at more like 30 to 40 minutes. But frankly, these companies are producing new technology as the market matures that makes it easier, faster, better, more reliable, and efficient. Now, I think the next question I always want to answer is, how do you buy a ghost gun? Right, so we've talked about what they are, how they're made, where do you buy them. They're really available anywhere you can find any other product, online, at stores, at gun shows. We did a really in-depth investigation of this marketplace, and we found 80 online sellers of unfinished frames and receivers in the United States. And the truth is, most came online in the past 5 years. So this is a market that is really rapidly growing and maturing, and there are a lot of options for individuals who are in the market to purchase these parts. There's an example of an ad here. And as you could see, this site is selling a product that doesn't just sell you the unfinished receiver. And they don't just sell you the unfinished receiver and the jig that I told you use to do the work, but they sell you all of the drill bits you need, all of the other parts you need to complete a fully operational AR-15. So it's a complete kit, for lack of a better word. And you can see the same exact advertisement for a semi-automatic handgun. Not only that, you can pay by credit card. All major credit cards accepted. MasterCard, Visa, Diners Club. That was a dad joke for Chris. And there's guidance on how to finish machining a frame or receiver. And that guidance comes not just through words and diagrams, but links to instructional videos. And frankly, I think I've talked to Justin about this a bunch, and he's on, and I hope if there's questions that he feels comfortable helping me answer them as well. But the videos and the guidance really walks you through step by step exactly how to do this work, and it's something that any novice can do. I for a long time I said it's as easy as making IKEA furniture, and then some friends in law enforcement started telling me that's a terrible example. It's easier than making IKEA furniture. And then I thought about the furniture that I've made and how long it's taken me and how many times I've messed up and how many pieces I've lost. And I thought to myself, yes, finishing a frame and receiver is far easier than ordering a piece of putting together a piece of IKEA furniture. But truthfully, it's as easy as ordering something from Amazon. And it's like, you can use FedEx and do all the things that you would think when you're having a kind of an online retail experience. So I think that then comes to like the next fundamental question is, who is using ghost guns, right? If this is a loophole and it's a marketplace, I think one of the easiest things to assume is that the person who is building these firearms is predominantly going to be sportsmen, hobbyists, tinkerers. And the truth is there are plenty of folks like that. They're acquiring these parts, they're building a firearm for lawful use, either for protection or recreation. They end up with a firearm without a serial number and they haven't passed a background check. Both are problems, but if they are law abiding, then they're building the gun that they're going to use for their own personal use. And that's largely a myth that I've heard many times. I've heard it from state legislators, I've heard it from elected officials, and I've certainly heard it from opponents of common sense gun laws. And I think the biggest thing that's changing, that is causing the most concern, is the data that's coming out. And I know Rep. Rose will speak, and he actually got an incredible piece of legislation through the National Defense Authorization Act to get us more data. But the data we're seeing so far is deeply concerning. In Los Angeles, right? So we're thinking about issues of city gun violence. 41% of ATF's cases involved a ghost gun. In Southern California, ATF said 30%. Washington, D.C. saw a 342% increase in ghost gun recoveries. And those are recoveries where firearms were recovered after serious violent crimes, homicide, robbery, assault. And so we're trying to pull the strings together to get all the data to show that this is a serious issue. The other thing we did is we looked back at all the federal prosecutions involving ghost guns for the past 10 years. Because we really wanted to see who's being prosecuted and why. And we found 114 federal prosecutions and about 2,500 ghost guns that were connected to criminal activity. And when we did our analysis, we read through the documents, we did our analysis, we found that nearly half of the defendants were prohibited possessors, individuals who couldn't pass a background check. That nearly half were gun traffickers who were engaged in the business of selling ghost guns, but were doing it undermining all the regulations. No license, no background check, none of the processes that protect us and try to keep guns in the hands of responsible law-abiding citizens and out of the hands of individuals who do harm. And the criminal prosecutions were as frightening as you could imagine: gun trafficking, robbery, drug trafficking, murder. And so it's very clear that ghost guns are fueling criminal enterprises, and they're being used by prohibited possessors to commit crimes. And our cities are frankly seeing a significant spike in their recovery. And once you learn about ghost guns, you see these articles everywhere. I just saw one out of Omaha. I saw another one in Indiana. I mean, these recoveries are popping up because of the ease of acquiring and putting together these firearms. The other big category that I think you should know about is white supremacists are using ghost guns and openly discussing building them on popular online forums. We found ghost gun AR-15 made with widely available parts in a jig by members who were attending a Virginia rally, and they were accused of igniting a civil war. An admitted leader of a neo-Nazi group was found with all the parts he needed to build untraceable firearms. And on 4chan, in between the steady stream of racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic slurs, the hate, you'll see posts that talk about how easy and convenient it is to order your ghost gun from Polymer 80, and it'll send you a link to the best video showing you how to put it together. So the last two slides I want to hit before turning it over are kind of answering the last two questions: who created this problem and how do we fix it, right? Where I think we're all in the business of problem solving. We don't just want to know about a problem, we want to know how we fix it. And the truth is, this problem was created by ATF and can be fixed by ATF. I think our leaders in Congress can fix this as well. And I'll talk about some of the other actors that are critical to this chessboard. But the truth is, ATF created this, and they created this in the mid-2000s, where companies who were selling these products, making these products, asked for permission to sell them, and ATF changed their legal interpretation of what is a frame or receiver. ATF used to take the appropriate and correct view that the federal gun laws don't just look to form or technicalities; they look to how readily you can convert that piece into an operational frame or receiver. And so they rejected many, many applications and letter requests asking to sell these products without a background check and serial number. That doesn't mean companies couldn't sell them. It just meant that you have to put a serial number into a background check, right? This isn't a ban, this isn't a prohibition. This is saying that we should treat this product like any other firearm. We should treat ghost gun parts and ghost guns like guns. But so ATF, though, they moved their interpretation to where, and that's why the slides I showed you earlier were critical, to just looking at whether or not those 3 holes were drilled and that cavity was milled. Very technical, hyper technical, and incorrect. And just like with bump stocks, if you recall, ATF can analyze this position and they can correct this position. They can take the correct legal view and they can make a change. And so that gets me just to my last slide of how do we actually fix this? And we fix it by having ATF clarify its regulations and enforce the law. We filed a formal petition for rulemaking that laid out the full legal case with citation and expert opinion and a proposed new definition that would allow ATF to properly and appropriately regulate these products. And again, not to regulate them into a prohibition, but to regulate them and just say you have to have a serial number and background check. And if ATF fails to act, Congress can pass laws, states can pass laws, attorneys general can take action to enforce and interpret laws, and the companies that facilitate these sales, the credit card companies, can take action to slow the market. The last thing we know we need is to really make this case is more data collection, more dissemination, so we all can have the facts to expose this issue. And tying it back to where I started, I think point 1 is that ATF can take this action. We heard the former acting director of the ATF, Thomas Brandon, on 60 Minutes say he wanted ATF to take this action. And so with the right administration and the right gun sense president, we can stop this problem from metastasizing and growing, and we can get ghost gun parts to be regulated just like any other part for a firearm. There's a few resources here, our petition, our report, our fact sheet, which we can always get you. I think Chris or I'd be happy to provide them. But that is kind of the overview I had, and I hope it was helpful, and happy to take a couple questions if there's time. Chris.
Yeah, we have time for definitely at least one or two questions. Please raise your hand with the hand raise icon. For those resources, Rob, shoot those over to me so I have them, and I will put them in the email to this entire group that we'll send out later this week, as well as any other questions. Let's see. Anybody with a hand raise icon, or we just you can just. Well, Josh is asking if we can get a copy of the presentation.
Yeah, you definitely can, because the presentation is actually meant for anyone to give. And so our volunteers are giving this presentation across the country. So I'd be happy to send that to you, Chris.
Great. Robert has a question. Go ahead, Robert. You're off mute. You should be. I'm trying to.
Yeah, hi. So I was wondering, it was mentioned that YouTube, you can find these videos for assembly on YouTube. I mean, you can block anything else. So if we can push more, I guess, strict rules on these ghost guns, we touch with YouTube, or could state legislatures touch with you and say, hey, in state, these videos, these types of videos are not allowed?
So I think the states that are taking action aren't focused on the videos as much as the parts that are being sold into the state. And so we just saw Rhode Island pass a law. New York has one moving through its assembly, and there's one waiting on the Hawaii governor's desk. I'm sure Chris is putting pressure on the governor. But that's, I think, when we work in the state legislatures, that's really where our focus is on requiring these parts when they're sold in that state to have a background check or serial number, and to prohibit the possession of ghost guns that don't have serial numbers on them.
Awesome.
And if I have time for one more.
How about, if you don't mind, can you put that one in the chat box? I'm going to get one from David Lucier. Any other questions, folks, that put in the chat box? We're going to have Rob try to answer those on email later. But David, go ahead and ask your question there.
Hey, thanks. I was just wondering if an executive order would be possible to prohibit these ghost guns, much the same as there was an executive order prohibiting sale of bump stocks.
That's exactly right, David. I think there both could be strengthened enforcement, and there could be official rulemaking by the ATF to clarify the regulation. To Justin's question, the regulation now says that a frame or receiver contains the hammer, breech, or bolt lock and firing mechanism. And the ATF has taken a narrow view that it needs to be over 80% complete to meet that technical definition. And so, we suggest that the recommended definition includes that it's the part that contains the trigger group and is intended to be marketed as, or can readily be converted to be, an operational frame or receiver.
Awesome. As I mentioned, you were either scared of ghost guns before you came into this briefing, or now that you have this information, you're pretty scared too. So thanks, Rob, for all of that. Like I said, any other questions, put them in the chat box. Rob's really good at answering them. Both he'll answer them for you live now while we do this interview, and then we'll convey the answers to everybody later as well. So thank you, Rob. Moving on, it's now time it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest. Congressman Max Rose serves New York's 11th Congressional District, representing Staten Island and South Brooklyn. Representative Rose is a U.S. Army veteran who served in Afghanistan. He continues to serve in the National Guard. He's Ranger qualified, and his military awards include the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantry Badge. Congressman Rose currently sits on the House Committee on Homeland Security and the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. He has seen firsthand how our service members and veterans struggle when they return home. He believes that it's more important than ever that we take serious steps to improve veterans' healthcare and to make sure they can seamlessly access the benefits they earned. Congressman has received a BA in history from Wesleyan University and an MSc in philosophy and public policy from the London School of Economics. And here's a really interesting fact about today's forum meeting. Our subject matter expert, Rob Wilcox, and our distinguished guest, Representative Max Rose, both attended Wesleyan University for college. What you didn't know is that they both also attended the same high school in Brooklyn. Doesn't say much about our educational diversity today of our guests. I apologize for that. But it is a nice nod to Poly Prep Country Day School. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Congressman Max Rose. Congressman, welcome.
I had no idea. That's awesome. Well, thank you all so much for having me today. And that was a phenomenal presentation and a scary one too. You know, we see skyrocketing gun violence across the country. This, of course, is no new reality, though. And I thank everyone on your team and all the supporters of this great organization for being cognizant of that day in and day out, not just when there is a mass shooting in a suburb. It's an unfortunate reality that our media seems to only focus on when that is happening. But take New York City, for instance. When you look at the gun crime trace data for guns retrieved from gun crime incidents, the vast majority of them originate from out of the city, from down south. They flow up the Iron Pipeline. You all know this story. Why do I bring this up during a discussion about ghost guns? Because the reality of gun violence has been that you have to solve it and address it with federal legislation. Ghost guns elevates that to a new reality, an absolute new reality. Now, I come before you today, though, as someone who actually got ghost gun legislation across the finish line, signed by the President of the United States just this past year. You all probably didn't hear about it. That was intentional. Intentional because this is an issue that has become incredibly politicized. Politicized not just because of the NRA and the money that they give out, but politicized because of the ways in which it turns out base voters and so on and so forth. But our legislation mandated that the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis produce annual studies and push them down to local law enforcement on the availability of ghost guns for terrorists. Remember, this is not just a terrorist issue. This is an issue that exposes ghost guns to criminals as well. What are some other things, though, that we should do? Data. We need data on this problem. We do not know the extent of this issue. Number two is the wonderful information you just put out on the ATF in either an executive order or via federal legislation. Number three, I'm a plain-spoken guy. People should not be able to make guns in their home. No 3D printing of guns in your home, plain and simple, plastic guns or otherwise. Not allowed, should not be done. This is not a toy, it kills people. Number four, if you ship a gun part, you get a background check. A gun part is the same thing to me as a gun. If you're a hobbyist, God bless you. We have a Second Amendment. Just go to a licensed FFL, go through a background check, get the gun part there. Very, very, very simple. And then lastly, and I think that this is really of the most significance, we have to change our definition of what a gun is. Okay, a gun is not 80% of something. Stop. Okay, a gun is a gun part. And the second that we move away from that distinction, we break the silos that exist now in our perceptions of ghost guns. And then I said lastly, but like a good politician, I've got one more thing. You should ban ghost guns and how to make them. You also have to ban all of the blueprints that are available teaching people how to do this. In the same way that we are actively and proactively pushing out of the internet and out of availability for people manuals for how to make bombs, terrorist manuals, so on and so forth, we have to do the same for ghost guns because these things kill people. I'm a law and order guy. I care about public safety. If you consider yourself a law and order elected official, if you consider yourself someone that supports the cops, if you consider yourself someone who cares about safety of communities, then you have to care about ghost guns. Plain and simple, and you have to do something about it rather than just send thoughts and prayers. We saw in Halle, Germany, a ghost gun being used in a terrorist act. We are going to see much, much more of this. I am the leader in Congress in looking at the white supremacist, white nationalist, global neo-Nazi threat. It is no shock that on Telegram, 4chan, 8chan, they are talking about and disseminating information about how to use ghost guns, how to make them, how to ship them, how to build them. This is a threat that we should not just address after blood is spilled. Let's do the hardest thing that we can do in government. The hardest thing to do in government is to act before a crisis, to act before people die. And that's what we're going to get done. And I know that we're going to do that together. So with that, thank you for having me. Thank you for the tremendous work you're doing. I look forward to a wonderful conversation.
Fantastic. Congressman, thank you for being a leader on ghost guns, on this kind of legislation, on the legislation you've already pushed through, and obviously what you're going to do in the future. I'm going to start with a couple of questions from me, and then we're going to open it up to everybody else as well. I heard something really interesting you said about a year ago. You appeared on a podcast with our friend Ken Harbaugh called Reclaiming Patriotism. I happen to be a producer on that podcast. Ken and I go way back. And when I was listening to it to prepare for this interview, and you said something that really struck me, it resonated with me, and I think it resonates with a lot of the veterans on this call, right? These are all veterans who care about gun violence prevention and gun reform. You asked Ken, and I'm quoting this, you said, "Don't you still get that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you start to talk about your military service? Like you're kind of a fraud." And then Ken kind of cut you off, but he forced you to basically do that exact thing. He forced you to talk about your military service and to talk about how military service and military experience for in Congress can save lives in combat, right? Because the decisions you make, for example, to go to war or all the way down to up armoring Humvees, which we know saved your life. Can you talk about, to this group of veterans, can you talk about how you found ways to employ your own military experience in your job, whether it's about gun legislation or anything else, but even when it might be uncomfortable to talk about that?
You know, it's especially true amongst GWAT vets where, you know, I deployed in 2012, 2013. And when and I enlisted in like 2010. So when you think about it, right, my drill sergeants had deployed 3 times. You know, my RIs in Ranger School had deployed 4 or 5 times, some of them with Ranger Bat. When I was a platoon leader, my squad leaders had deployed twice. My platoon sergeant 4 times, to include in the initial invasion of Iraq. And so even when you deploy once, you feel like a piece of shit. Like it's like, you know, you haven't done, you feel just this constant sense of, and Jason Kander actually writes some great stuff about this, because I mean, I served amongst heroes. I mean, we've never asked veterans to do what we've asked veterans to do, or soldiers to do post 9/11, year on, year off, year on, year off, constantly. But this sense of I ain't shit can also is something that we have to start to push back on people, because I do feel that there are probably some vets out there that are suffering in silence because they feel like they didn't see shit, they didn't do shit. There's always there's a culture that's kind of emerged in the military of, it was so much worse 5 years ago. You know, when it comes to the actual act of legislating, I have no idea what aspects of my personality were in place pre-military and what aspects of my personality were in place post-military. You know, sometimes people come up to me and they're like, "Man, like, are you such a piece of shit because you were in the military?" Like, "Oh, I might have been a piece of shit beforehand." Or, "Are you so aggressive, you know, or this or that, or are you so sensitive," or whatever it might be. I have no idea. But what I do know is being in the military showed me what we're capable of as a country. You know, it showed me what happens when people come, and you hear this line all the time, but it's the truth. People come together and they put their differences aside. And it speaks to some of the most amazing things about not just the United States military, but the United States government. And what we're capable of as a country with resources, strategy, and solidarity. And for me, there should be no distinction between that type of will to get the job done, to take that hill, to do whatever's necessary, that fundamental self-confidence that the United States military has as an institution, why can't we have that for other public institutions? Why can't we have that as we seek to address the epidemic of gun violence? And to me, we should. We can. It's just with resources, solidarity, planning, and patriotism.
I think that's exactly right. It's one of the things that we're trying to do here at Everytown. When we work with veterans, we talk a lot about actually the positive implicit bias that the veterans get, and the idea that if you can get over your reticence to talk about your own military service, you can actually have some credibility and respect that you gain by virtue of being a veteran to serve a greater good like gun violence prevention. Not to mention, of course, with gun violence prevention, we also have experience and expertise in the handling of firearms. When we bring it specifically to ghost guns, you may have heard me earlier, and I tell this group all the time that we built our veteran engagement strategy at Everytown around 3 basic principles that we call the pillars of military gun culture. And those are training, safety, and accountability. I never get tired of repeating those 3 words because to me, they articulate, they not only explain how veterans should feel about common sense gun reform, but also articulate the basics of why they should feel that way, right? Because of what we learned in the military, that training, safety, and accountability. It was drilled into our heads. So when it comes to ghost guns, and you and Rob both touched on it, unserialized, untraceable, 80% made, home assembled firearms that can kill somebody just as easily as any other gun, but they don't require a background check and or any other regulation because the ATF said so arbitrarily or years ago determined that these aren't guns. The legislation that you push through, and future legislation you may work on in this area, or what we could do with the gun sense majority in the Senate or a gun sense. How can any self-respecting veteran, based on our military experience, and the way we know about accountability we must have for our weapons, how can we fail to condemn the concept of ghost guns as it exists? Any veteran in Congress, for example, how can they fail to condemn this?
Yeah, well, it's tough to get in the head of any of my colleagues, veteran or otherwise. But I do go back to, and I've learned the lesson of I don't want to necessarily assault their characters. But with that being said, though, I do go back to a conversation that I had multiple times, the military hurry up and wait. At my combat outpost in Afghanistan with some of my squad leaders and my platoon sergeant, and they just love to bullshit, right? So we're talking actually about gun control, and they're all, myself included. I was a gun owner at the time, and go to the range constantly. I mean, in Texas, that was in El Paso. That's like golf, right? You hit the range on the weekend, and I'm like, dude. You're telling me you really don't support universal background checks? Like you're cool with like criminals buying guns? And they're like, no, of course that makes sense, right? But then it always comes to the point right thereafter of, well, but what's going to come next after? What are you going to do next after that? What's the legislation after that? Where you're coming for my guns. And it's this, which is rooted in a complete absence of trust of elected officials, particularly in the Democratic Party, that who often speak with zero fluency about military weapons and often don't respect the culture of gun ownership. And so I do think that is what we have to address if we have any hope of addressing some of this low-hanging fruit. That's point 1. Point 2, though, is if people do not want to address this, like a ghost gun, right? If they seriously want to allow terrorists and criminals to make weapons in their home, then you know what? I want to respect them, give them every opportunity to join me in common sense, hopefully bipartisan legislation to robustly address this public safety problem. And if not, I'm going to wring it around their freaking neck come election day. They should suffer the consequences for this on election day because they're putting the American people in danger. You're on mute, buddy.
I am on mute. Sorry about that. I'm going to open it up to everybody to ask a question. We have a couple hands raised. We have a couple in the chat. So I'm going to go to Matt first. Put one in the chat. We'll go to John next. Matt wrote, you can read it there. Why aren't we talking about coupling anti-ghost gun legislation with pro-gun ownership legislation so that it gains more traction and has broader support? If you attach national carry permit law with anti-ghost guns, you'd have massive support, he says. Thoughts on that, Congressman?
Yeah, so well, to look at your specific scenario, it would be difficult for me to get behind a national carry permit. You know, as a New Yorker, I don't want someone coming in from somewhere else abiding by other, you know, if you want to respect states' rights in this one regard, then I think you have to be consistent in terms of that. Conversely, I wouldn't argue for federal legislation to reject a law-abiding person's ability to carry a concealed weapon in another state that determines their legislation in that regard. But I am certainly open to creative solutions to get this across the aisle. What I worry, though, is that some of my colleagues across the aisle around guns and taxes have become just total absolutists, right? Have just become totally opposed to doing anything for fear of how that might play in Republican primaries. Now, I'm cognizant of political realities. Again, I do not judge their character, but I'm not even sure if a compromise like that would have political saliency, no matter how sensible it would be.
John, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question, or if you can unmute yourself. John, there.
Yeah,
There
my basic question is, whenever I talk to other veterans, and in my case, it's mostly pilots, about the Second Amendment, they have this idea that the Second Amendment gives them complete immunity from any kind of consequence whatsoever. So they don't mind if you want to be a pilot, you have to have a pilot's license, or if you want to drive a car, you have to have a car inspection, or if you want to build a building, you have to have a permit and go by code. But they just feel that the Second Amendment just gives them absolutely carte blanche to not have any restrictions, not worry about any consequences. They can set up whatever condition, unsafe condition they want, and create as much risk as they want, and that's just the get out of jail free card that the Second Amendment is. And I have to try and tell them that. And so my question to you is, you know, have you ever had that conversation, and how do you respond?
That's why I hate pilots, by the way. They're so you should stop associating with them. You know, they say I got to get 10 hours of sleep. I have to have this free flowing hair. They're jackasses. But I think it comes back to a central point, which is that the Constitution and legal scholars across the political spectrum and in the philosophical spectrum agree on this. There's very few, if no such existence of absolute rights. You don't have the absolute right to free speech. What the Constitution is all about is balancing rights against each other. And there is actually right now no absolute right to gun ownership either. You don't have a right to own a grenade launcher in the United States of America. You don't have the right, law-abiding citizens, you don't have the right to own a 50 cal. So what we are doing here is we are seeking and we've been doing this for hundreds of years in this country, seeking to balance these competing rights against one another, the right to public safety, the right to expression. We all go back to the notion of you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So I do think that is commonly understood and is something that I return to in discussions like this.
Thank you. I want to jump in on the pilot thing just quickly, but because I'm a Black Hawk pilot, I just want to make sure you're talking about fixed wing and not Black Hawk. We don't count, right?
It's all of you.
Okay. We'll remember that next time you're stuck in hearing out. Anyway,
you have to understand this comes from jealousy. I mean, this is not. This is how insecure infantrymen lash out.
Well, I'm going to go just to sort of run this pilot thing. She's not a pilot, but she was a member of the Air Force. So I'm going to go to Shannon. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please be nice to pilots and go ahead and do it.
Congressman, I want to thank you for
Call
serving.
me Max, please.
Max, thank you for serving in Congress, because there are days when I would rather go back to Iraq than go to Congress and do your job. And I think you may have already answered my question with your comment about the complete absolutists on guns and taxes, but I'll ask it anyways. I was just kind of curious if in this era where the NRA seem to be imploding and they are having a lot of trouble legally and financially, do you sense that any of your colleagues might backtrack and be thinking that maybe we need to be on the side of sensible gun reform? Or do you think they're just going to lose their jobs when it comes to the election?
You know, look, I have a lot of hope in political courage. And that's not just in the Democratic Party, that's in the Republican Party as well. I'm an optimist by nature. And so long as I'm in this business, I will believe that we can get this done even if we're in a divided government. What's fascinating is, and there's evidence of that. You know, there was a time when the Democratic Party couldn't get gun legislation across the finish line. There was a time where the Democratic Party, you know, its only pathway to winning back majorities, look at 2006, was by electing people who were ardently pro-gun. Those days are now behind us. So things shift, parties shift. The Republican Party 10 years ago was a free trade, largely jingoistic, fiscally conservative, at least in their nature, party that actually was more pro-immigration than the Democrats. Look how much the party shifted in 10 years. So we'll see how these things shift. But I do think ultimately it does come down to the notion of where are there more political consequences? It's money and political consequences, money and electoral consequences. And for us to show that there are electoral consequences in the general election for many people, I think is important as they make that internal political calculus. And that will never go away. The importance of that will never go away.
I'm gonna go, we have time for one or two more questions. I'm gonna go to Pete, who's here first. Pete, go ahead.
Thanks, Congressman. One of
you can call me Max's for everybody.
Okay, thanks, Max. One of the accomplishments you highlight on your website is directing the intelligence community to study the threat of ghost guns. So my two-part question. First, have we heard back? Is that report, or what does that data collection look like? Are we hearing what the intelligence community agencies are reporting on ghost guns, and anything that you could share with us? And then second, what are other places where we can direct, whether it's intelligence agencies or other federal agencies, to collect data to help us craft solutions to gun violence problems? If you had your dream bill that could get more data to help combat the problem, what would that look like? Thank you.
Yeah, so we have not gotten any reports back. Maybe we would have without COVID, but so that remains to be seen. But my hope is that these reports would add to the data that we're talking about here. You know, one of the things that I've faced in our efforts against the emerging threat of domestic terrorism is we don't fully understand what the threat is, because the intelligence community has not been empowered to address, to look at it and analyze it. The same is true for ghost guns. We don't know how many are retrieved from crime scenes. We don't know where they're bought from. We don't know how many, you know, just we don't know. If you don't know the problem, you can't address it. So I am hoping that this will allow for further empowerment of entities like you too, to seek and to propose and advance creative points of legislation and to mobilize people around it. Now, secondly, though, to the question of what else could we do if I had a proverbial magic wand, besides the legislation that I spoke about, right? I do think that, and you may not even need a magic wand for this, I do think that we have to bring things back to the threat of terrorism and the relation of ghost guns to it. you know, when there has been any sense of momentum around ghost guns, we are reminding people, I mean, Chuck Schumer was doing this a decade ago, that if you can make a plastic gun at home, you can get it on a plane, right? And then the list goes on and on and on for the other ways in which people could potentially use ghost guns or 3D printed weapons to engage in terrorist attacks, particularly as the modern day terrorist is more likely to be a lone shooter, a lone gunman, gunwoman who has been self-radicalized via the internet. We can see that radicalization being connected to a tutorial on how to acquire and manufacture or build a ghost gun. So bringing things back to that level of analysis and proactive focus on the terrorist threat, I think could be unifying. But let's not overly intellectualize this problem, okay? You treat a gun part like a gun. Call it a day. Call it a day. Ban equipment that allows you to make guns at home. Call it a day. We don't need, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to address this, although Rob, you very well might be a rocket scientist. I don't know your background besides you went to Poly.
We don't make many rocket scientists at Poly.
No, we don't actually. We don't. We don't. Irish and Italians, man, at Poly. It's.
All right. My connection might be getting a little spotty. That's true. Everybody hear me? Yeah. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Sorry, my connection might be getting spotty, folks. I apologize. But we are at a point where we're going to wrap up another session of Veterans of Gun Sense 2020. So I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to Congressman Max Rose for joining us. Congressman, it's really, truly been a pleasure speaking with you. Please keep championing common sense gun reform on behalf of everywhere in Congress. Thank you for doing all the work that you do there.
Thank you so much again. Absolutely my pleasure.
I'd like to thank Rob Wilcox for educating us all on ghost guns. If you weren't scared before, hopefully you are now. Remember to speak up with that veteran voice that we all have about ghost guns, how dangerous that concept is for all Americans. Our next forum meeting is going to be 2 weeks from now, Tuesday, September 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be joined by Representative Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey. She's a Navy veteran. And we will also be joined by Sarah Trumbull from Everytown to talk about federal background checks. Should be an interesting one, actually, talking about a bill that passed 18 months ago, H.R. 8, that created federal background checks in the House, but hasn't been touched by the Senate. So we'll see what that looks like. And then finally, please remember to invite a buddy to this forum. Simply share the survey link with others and ask them to put your name down as a referral. If you join us at the last minute today, I was doing invite. Make sure you go back and fill out that survey for us and spread. Thanks to Mara and the Everytown staff behind the scenes help. And thanks to members of the VAC for supporting this effort. Again, sorry if my connection got spotty at the end there. Hopefully you guys can hear me, but I'll make it better in 2 weeks when I see you again. So thanks everybody.